Bon. Bonjour à tous et à toutes. Les amis, en cours de discipline, on va commencer. C'est vous que je regarde. Est-ce que tout le monde m'entend? Ça va? Cool. Bon, comme vous le voyez bien, je ne suis pas Karsten, je ne suis pas assez grande, mais j'ai quand même le plaisir de vous présenter le conférencier d'aujourd'hui. C'est J.Eden qui vient de Coventry University. C'est une année magnifique pour parler des changements climatiques et des modèles climatiques. Donc, je vais vous laisser à sa présentation. Amusez-vous bien. Et Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Bonjour. Merci beaucoup pour l'opportunité. C'est très agréable pour moi parler aujourd'hui. And you can probably tell I don't speak French, so I will try, try to speak as clearly and as concisely as I can. I appreciate the opportunity to be here today. It's my first time in this part of Canada. I've worked a little bit with colleagues from UCAT previously on other projects and always said that I would try and visit at some point in the future. But today, I'm going to talk about the title that you see on the screen, fire weather in a changing climate, and what that means for our forests. Particularly, well, we take a global approach in much of what I will talk about today, but trying to gear this to the boreal or the circumboreal forests of the Northern Hemisphere as much as possible. Just to acknowledge some other people that have worked on this over the course of the last 4 or 5 years or so from different parts of the world. Igor Drobyshev, my colleague, who's at the Swedish University of Agricultural Sciences, was an adjunct professor here and was based here for a number of years. It's always nice to see Igor. I'm sure he would like to come back at some point. I used this for a job interview not that long ago, and someone recommended to take all of my abstracts and all the papers that I've published and create a word cloud that demonstrates what I'm doing. And you can see that maybe fire is a smaller part of that. I am a climate scientist by training. My PhD was in climate modeling, global climate modeling, particularly for understanding changes in rainfall at small spatial scales. When I was a postdoc in the Netherlands, I had an opportunity to be involved in a project involving colleagues here, involving Yves Bergeron and Igor as well, on understanding seasonal prediction of fire activity across the circumboreal region. And this led me in a very interesting path towards what we can do with our climate models to better understand fire danger in the past and also in the future. So that's a little bit about my background. I suppose where my own research interest sits, it's kind of the interface of climate modeling and statistical analysis. My key topics in my research history are statistical downscaling, producing high resolution climate information, evaluation of climate models, where do they perform well and where do they not perform so well, and then a real interest in extreme events, extreme weather and climate events, be that heat waves, droughts, or increasingly so, wildfires. And with respect to thinking about fire weather, and I'll come on to these topics a little bit more as we go on, but the questions that emerge from my personal research interests in the context of thinking about fire weather and fire danger are: how well are the current generation of climate models able to simulate fire weather or fire danger, or the meteorological conditions that are conducive to fire? How will forest fire danger change in a warming world? And how can we better understand the drivers, I suppose, the climate drivers of extreme fire weather? If I quite like to use this with my students just to, well, to demonstrate, I'm sure that everyone here is more familiar than I am with the state of the world's forest, but just to point out where the world's forests are, the fact that the world's forests are, of course, very diverse, very different, and there's different ways in which we can categorize that. If we were to pick to show that the needle leaf trees in the forests of the Northern Hemisphere, or the evergreen broadleaf trees in the equatorial regions, deciduous broadleaf trees, and then mixed/other. There's obviously many ways in which we can build these classifications, and when it comes to at least global scale climate projections, it's important to be aware that, of course, the forests are very diverse, but they're also wide ranging as well. Okay, so just a little primer. I'm not going to spend too long on this, but just with respect to how the world's climate has changed, just I suppose so we're all on the same page. This is a lot of what I'm using here, and the next few slides is from a really excellent infographic which was produced by a scientific journalist called John Lang, who essentially decomposed the most recent report of the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change into a series of infographics. It's very, very useful indeed. But essentially, the atmospheric levels of CO2 in our atmosphere are already higher than at any time that they've been in the last 2 million years. We more or less know that as a fact. If we look at what that means for change in global surface temperature of the Earth, if we were to look at paleoclimate archives going back roughly 2,000 years, we'd see something along the lines of what we see here. Anything in black is essentially paleoclimate archives, and then anything that we've been measuring, we see there in the red. And obviously there's a very noticeable spike towards the end of that. And that's changes since the pre-industrial era, and those changes are down to us. A couple of other factoids: that current rate of heating is unprecedented in the last 2,000 years. And the last decade was, in all likelihood, the hottest decade in the last 125,000 years. So that's setting the scene to some extent. There's different ways in which we can show this information. Hopefully that GIF works quite nicely. This is a climate spiral developed by Ed Hawkins at the University of Reading, who's one of Britain's, one of the world's top climate scientists, but very dedicated towards putting information in the most simplistic form possible and demonstrating how that global temperature change has increased at different times of year throughout the past 170 years or so. So what about the future? And again, I don't know how much of this is common knowledge, so I'm not spend a massive amount of time on it, but the UN has an Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. This is a group of scientists, a group of climate scientists, a large group of climate scientists from all around the world that publishes an assessment report every 6 or 7 years on the state of the world's climate. And none of this report is not new research. It's essentially a large literature review in a common framework. And the most recent report, which was the 6th assessment report published between, 2021 and 2023, uses 5 scenarios or pathways to investigate how greenhouse gas emissions and global warming are likely to increase in the future. And we can use those pathways or those scenarios as the basis for policy decisions. Essentially, we have the very low emission scenario. This is the best case scenario where the world achieves net zero by 2050. If the governments keep their current promises, and that's a big if, we would continue on a trajectory which is the intermediate emissions trajectory known as SSP 4.5. However, if we start to abandon our policies, and very concerned about what the UK government is doing at the moment in kind of abandoning plans to or abandoning commitments made for net zero. A reversal of the climate policies would lead us down this very pessimistic path. So in terms of where we go from here, our future climate is going to be influenced by the policy decisions that we make now, by the way that we vote as individuals, and the way that we raise these issues with the people that we elect. I won't go into massive detail, but you can see actually on the next slide, I think we can. Yes, this is essentially a breaking down of what we see those there in the lines. So the year in which we potentially halve our CO2 emissions, we have it in our power to do that. Yeah, fairly soon if we wanted to, by 2035. If we're following the current policies that the world's governments have agreed to, we're looking at more towards the end of the century. And there's no way that's happening if we follow a very high emission scenario. A few years ago, this 1.5 degree goal was made very publicized. We are approaching that goal, or rather approaching that threshold rapidly. It is likely that we will exceed that that goal within the next few years. And then if we consider the 2 degree goal, so this is a world that's 2 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial levels. Potentially we would get there if we abandoned our policies and kept up with our essentially what we've been doing for the last 20 years or so. We would be exceeding this within the next 20 years, easily within the next 20 years. So 1.5 degree warmer world is going to become a 2 degree warmer world unless we do something about that. I'm fairly, when I present these slides, I'm always accused of being quite pessimistic, but one thing that we do know is once our CO2 emissions reach net zero, the heating will very quickly start to stabilize, ideally after just a few years. So we do have the power to choose our own future, I suppose. But that's enough about climate projections in general, and I'll talk a little bit more about what that means for forests and for fires. I mean, in terms of what the impacts of a warmer world have been on our forests and how those changes will manifest into the future. Obviously there's many of these impacts, and I'm not going to talk about them all today, but just to give some examples: drought, pathogens, increase in insects, snow and ice, I guess in different parts of the world, more important than others. Wind as well. Wind is something that we don't model particularly well. We don't really understand how much wind will change in the changing climate. But fires is the thing that I've spent most of my time focusing on in the last few years, and that's the thing that I'll talk a bit more about today. So just some facts. If we're thinking about the global situation, the area burned by wildfires has increased by about 13% since the early part of the 21st century. Wildfire occurrence is expected to increase by 1/3 over the next 30 years or so. And we have obviously projections of warmer, drier, less humid conditions, and therefore longer fire seasons. And specifically, as outlined in the abstract that I shared before the talk, when we're thinking about fire danger under climate change, there's 3 areas that I'm going to talk about today. So the evaluation of our climate models to simulate fire danger and how well they do that in different parts of the world, and why it's really important to be aware of that when we're using information from climate models for our own impact models or sort of smaller scale regional models. Where the climate projections should in fact be weighted according to how well they perform, and I'll come on to that in later on. And then towards a better understanding of trends in fire weather extremes. But I'll first of all talk a little bit about climate model performance. So again, I don't know how much of this is common knowledge, but when we talk about climate models, we're generally talking about global models. And there's around 35 of these models that are built in different centres around the world. There's a Canadian model, there's a UK model, several American models, for instance. And around 35 or so of those contribute to something called the Coupled Model Intercomparison Project. That's now in its 6th phase. So coupled model means anytime you have an atmospheric model and an ocean model, that's essentially a coupled model, but it can also have other modeling components as well. And there's around 35 of those models that feed into the projections that were shared in the most recent report of the IPCC in 2021. So it's a continuous challenge to evaluate these models when there's so many. We kind of want there to be as many models as possible because all models are wrong to some extent. So we should be encouraging modeling centres around the world to build their own models. All of these models are kind of built in slightly different ways. Of course, they're following physical principles of based on thermodynamics and other aspects of the climate system. But the assessment of how well the model is performing needs to be done for specific objectives or for specific variables. So quite often, when we're producing projections for the future, climate projections, we'll have a series of models and we'll just take all of those models and just take an average of them. So essentially a multi-model mean, which doesn't consider whether some of those models are performing better than others. So a kind of key question is, should we be more selective about that? Should we identify the climate models that are performing well and simply base our projections on those and cast the rest aside? And this is a very individual and topic-driven question. It's definitely not something that would happen at the IPCC level, because that's quite political to suggest to, your model isn't good enough to be in our elite group, if you like. So we know a little bit about how well our global models are performing in terms of their simulation of temperature and of precipitation and a number of other atmospheric variables. But we don't know so much about how well they simulate fire weather or meteorological conditions conducive to fire. So that includes considering temperature, rainfall, relative humidity, and wind. Some people are familiar with the development of the fire weather index, and obviously this is an index that originally was designed for application in Canada. I spent last week at the Great Lakes Forestry Centre learning a bit more about the developments of this index, because it's still kind of based on empirical relationships from decades ago, and things have changed. It may be that it needs adjusting slightly to better cope with a warming world. But this is something, even though it was designed for application in Canadian pine forests, it is something that is applied kind of routinely across the world. So there's often global studies which will be based on the FWI. But there's also examples of studies that will consider some of the other components of the system. Particularly initial spread index, ISI, occasionally buildup index, drought code is used quite commonly. And then there's other things, there's things like vapor pressure deficits, and then other indices, for fire indices for other parts of the world. This is a figure showing correlation of burned area from a global burned area data set with annual data, so with annual means of each of the different components. And there's obviously areas where that correlation is quite high, areas where it's not so high. We don't necessarily all the time expect burned area to correlate with a high fire weather index, because there's many other variables at stake there. Obviously a higher forecast of the fire weather index, people are increasingly vigilant, for instance, and plans are put in place to help deal with fires that break out. But essentially, there's no real winner there. I mean, you could kind of make a case for any of those indices in a particular part of the world being the one that you select to represent your fire day. So it's important when we consider our evaluation of models, not just to consider how well the models are in simulating the fire weather index, but how well they simulate all of those components. So this is some work where we've essentially started to do this evaluation. Here we've got the multi-model mean. So we've taken daily fields from 16 of the global climate models that we used in that IPCC report that I shared. We've taken the mean of those, and then we're comparing that with a global reanalysis program, which is essentially a background forecast model that includes observations. It's essentially an observational data set. So the fire weather index across the whole world. And then we can look at simply one, take away the other, and look at the biases. So anywhere you see red on this map, the model is overestimating fire weather compared to reality. Anywhere it's blue where the model is underestimating that. And this was repeated for not just the fire weather index, but for all the indices. Obviously, the global overview makes it quite challenging to really, challenging to make interpretations that are meaningful for people, I think is what I mean. We broke this down further at the regional scale using these fire regions from the global fire emissions data set. And I appreciate that there's different ways of doing that. These aren't eco regions. There's an awful lot going on in each of those regions with respect to vegetation and that kind of thing, but it is at least a place to start. And if we focus on boreal North America, and let's have a look at how well that multi-model mean, all of the climate models together are performing. So here we've got all of the components of the fire weather index on the y-axis, as you can see there, and then different months of the year. We've got different triangles in this matrix. The bottom triangle represents the mean. The top triangle there represents the 90th percentile. And yeah, anywhere where this is, again, it's biased. So the red colours are where these indices are being overestimated. The blue ones where they're being underestimated. We maybe don't care so much about what's happening in this part of the world these times of year. So we identified across the board a fire season. So that's the months in which the burned area is at least 50% of the monthly maximum. So our fire season across that entire area is May to September, which I appreciate is not going to be the same across the whole of this area, but it is one way of just isolating that period. So the multi-model mean is performing reasonably well, certainly during the fire season for most of those indices. The bias is quite low. I won't go into too much detail, but essentially what we've just been looking at there is in the top left-hand corner, and this analysis was repeated for all the fire regions across the world. And it's very, very region dependent in terms of the model performance. That's what we kind of take home point that we might take from this particular figure. Some of the models do show consistently lower performance than others, and I'll come on to that a little bit more in a second. We also wanted to look at the individual performance of each model. So what we were looking at earlier was essentially the multi-model average. Here are the 16 individual models. Again, just to identify a few, that's the Canadian Earth System model. We have these two models are French models, Russian models, German models, for instance. The top two are Australian. This is a Taylor diagram. This allows us to depict 3 different metrics of model performance on one diagram, because all of these things are statistically connected. So we've got spatial correlation, root mean squared area, and then the ratio of standard deviation. And essentially, the closer the model is to this origin point here, the the stronger it is. And if we identify, for instance, this model, this is MRI ASM2. This model has a very high spatial correlation, almost 0.5, but it vastly overestimates the variance. Anything to this side of this line is underestimating the variance. So there's the models that perform well in some metrics and not others. If we were to break that down and look at the performance of our 16 models across, again, Boreal North America, in this matrix, we've got individual cells. Again, I don't expect to look at every single detail here, but we've got individual cells, one for each fire weather index, and then one for the mean, one for the 90th percentile, the correlation, group mean squared error, and the ratio standard deviation. And essentially, for all these colours, the darker the colour, the stronger the performance. So we can see that there are models that are performing reasonably well most of the time. This is a clear example, MPI ESM2. Colours are relatively dark across all three of those, but there are examples of where models are performing well in one metric and less well in another. So the two French models, for instance, reproduce the spatial variability. They reproduce the mean reasonably well, but they don't do so well with the variance. So if one was working in the Boreal North America as a study region, and you were looking for just perhaps one climate model to feed into an impact model, this would probably be the one that you pick, and this would be the evidence base for doing, I suppose. Likewise, if you were looking for models that you wanted to avoid, you could use this as well. So one thing that the IPCC doesn't like to do is to rank models by how well they're doing. They don't really want to point out models that aren't doing very well, but when you're doing individual studies like this, it's okay. So what we've done here is to rank the models according to overall performance. So we counted, not manually, the number of times that the model appeared in the top 33%, and then the number of times that it appeared in the lower 33%, the upper quartile and the lower quartile. So we've got all of the models here, all 16 models, all of the fire regions here as well, and then accounts on the side. And we can see that some models perform reasonably well across all of them, but it's not always the case. If I highlight the model that we identified just in the slide before, it's performing particularly well in Boreal North America, which is MPI ESM 1.2 high resolution. Sorry for rather verbose description. This model performs relatively strongly. In fact, it's the highest performing model in Boreal North America. Sorry, no, I can point at it. It performs very well here, but if we look at Boreal Asia, it's not a high performing model. So in that particular study region, we might usually consider another model, or perhaps a model that's representative of the conditions across the entire circumboreal region. So model performance is very region specific, because when we're studying fires, our studies tend to be regional. Okay, so it's really worthwhile checking which climate model has the best projections for the purpose that you need them for. Okay, the second thing I wanted to talk about is performance-based weighting. And what I mean by this is what I mentioned earlier is those IPCC projections will use all of the climate models available. There were 35 in the most recent report, and it will take a multi-model average of those. We were able to look at 16. There's various reasons for that. There was an awful lot of data to download. Not one of the input fields for the fire weather index is minimum relative humidity, minimum daily relative humidity. That's not something that's available for all the models, at least publicly. So we have 16 models. If we were to take an average of those, you get a multi-model mean. That doesn't tell us anything about which model is performing well. But should we instead consider simply the models that are performing well, and base our projections for the future purely on those models. Another alternative would be to consider which ones are performing well and which ones of them are maybe performing mediumly well, and then weight them accordingly. So we could actually do that with all of them, if we were interested in doing so. So it's very important for our projections for the future to be as robust and as reliable as possible. The reason that this activity is not done routinely is, again, it can be quite controversial, quite politically controversial to downweight a particular model. And I would say 15 years ago, when I was doing my PhD, it's something that simply wasn't done. It was avoided. It's maybe something that was looked at before then, but like, we don't really want to be weighting models. It's quite messy. But what's happened since then is that we have a lot more models than we used to. And those models, those 35 or so models, use similar components sometimes. They might be the same ocean model that's used in different models, or the same carbon cycle representation, or the same ocean biogeochemistry. So the models, a lot of the time, are not as independent as they used to be. They kind of share a common genealogy. So this approach of taking all of the models and calculating a mean assumes that the models, not only that they perform in the same with the same strength, but also that they are independent of one another, and that's not really the case. So what we've proposed is a kind of two-part weighting system where we consider the skill, which is another word for model performance. So how well is the model able to reproduce reality, and then how independent is the model? If we've got two models, those two Russian models, for instance, which are very, very similar, they probably shouldn't have the same weighting. They should be sort of half, right? So we take the skill, or the performance weighting, and the independence weighting, and then we combine the two. And we were very interested to see for FWI, for fire weather index, what the difference is between the weighted and the unweighted. So here we've got the reanalysis, the observations, the real world, effectively. And then we've got, we've got a reference period of 1980 to 2014, so a 35-year reference period. And then we've got our unweighted projections and our weighted simulations, but it's not future. A group of models that have averaged together, unweighted, and then we've got a weighted approach. And this is for the 90-day average FWI, which is effectively a fire seasonal mean. It's difficult to see any difference between those, so let's just have a look at another figure which shows the difference. Yeah, essentially, any area in red is where the weighted simulation is a lot or considerably higher than what we had in the unweighted one. So areas of North America, Southern Africa, Australia, and Eastern Eurasia are actually much higher when we use this weighted approach. We can also look at the bias again. So this is the difference between the observation and the model. And essentially this is telling us how well our projections are able to replicate what we have in reality. So the unweighted bias generally is higher across most of the world than what the bias that we get in the weighted simulation. So essentially, by taking this approach, we're reducing the bias and, in principle, making our simulations more robust, more representative of reality. So the weighted approach reduces the model bias, but what does that mean for projections of FWI? So if we consider projections into the future following that very high emission scenario, which we call SSP 8.5, this is the difference between a weighted and versus the unweighted projections. So anywhere in the dark colours is where that difference is quite large. anywhere that's kind of patched areas where it's statistically significant difference. But there's quite a lot of the world where there is a substantial difference between the two approaches. And in terms of what that means ultimately, if we, or implications, I suppose, for FWI projections, what we have here is what things look like for the last, well, for 1980 through to 2014. And then our projections, our medium-term projections, 2041 to 2060, and then long-term projections, 2081 to 2100. Essentially, what we find is that if we take this weighted approach, we produce simulations that are more robust because we reduce the bias, but FWI is considerably higher in large parts of the world than it otherwise would be if we took those standard projections. And we actually, that will be submitted soon and we'll have feedback on that, but it's actually quite striking in terms of what we find. Okay. The third thing that I wanted to talk about was onto understanding of trends in fire weather extremes. So I mentioned before I have a general interest in extreme events. In the past, that's been hydrometeorological extremes, I suppose, so floods and droughts, also heat waves, and now onto fires and fire weather extremes. I mean, when it comes to extremes, we've always had in the course of human history extreme events. That's not a new thing, but there is a growing interest, certainly over the last decade or so, about how the magnitude and the likelihood of extreme events might be changing and what the reasons behind that might be. So often there's a couple of newspaper reports from the United Kingdom following some floods. There's often a question, you know, there was a flood, what is the role of global warming? Was this flood caused by global warming? How much more likely is this heat wave as a result of a warming world? And there's often a kind of question of blame attached to that as well, but that's perhaps a different issue. And it's a really, answering this question for scientists is a really important way that we communicate climate science and science information, because extreme events are a very important way in which we experience climate change here and now. It's not, I mean, climate change is often considered or often perceived as being long-term, distant, abstract, rather than something that we're feeling on a day-to-day basis. And extreme events are a way in which we are affected, all of us, by that. We talked a little bit earlier about the impact on the fires last year, for instance, and the impacts that will have had on people living here. So being able to make a statement about that is potentially a very important tool in climate communication. And this has led to the emergence of a fairly new field in climate science, which is the attribution of individual events. Asking the question, how much more likely has a particular type of event become due to climate change? And we try and do this in the immediate aftermath of the event, while the event's still in the public consciousness, and while we're still able to make that connection. And if we do it properly, we can satisfy media curiosity and also cement our reputations as climate scientists. But just to use an example of how this would work, an individual event can tell us nothing about whether the climate is changing. There has always been heat waves, there has always been floods, there's always been fires. But instead, attribution studies are trying to determine how much more, oh, I've gone on timing, sorry. Yeah, how much more likely a particular event is as a result of human-induced climate change. So this is an example of, imagine a baseball player, that baseball player decides to take steroids and then the next season hits 20% more home runs than they did before the steroids. So you can't attribute a single home run to steroids because the player may have hit home runs before then. What you can say is how much more likely it is the player will hit a home run as a result of this change, which is the taking of steroids. So in the last 10 years or so, there's been a real explosion in the number of attribution studies in different parts of the world. This is a nice figure from Carbon Brief. You can kind of pick out the different event types. I'm going to go into huge detail, but of those 400, around 130 or so have been studies about heat waves. Around 80 have been studies about floods. And there's only been 16 or so, slightly higher number now, I think, but 16 on wildfires specifically. So we were quite keen to use the methods that we've developed, our knowledge of the climate models, and apply that to a real world fire. Just to make the point that only 16 wildfires, despite a lot of media interest, and this recent UN report about the likely increase in wildfire occurrence. So what we tried to do is combine weather observations with those climate models that I've been talking about to generate fire weather index, and use extreme value analysis to perform this attribution of extreme fire weather events. And I've got a case study that I'll talk about. This is the 2020 fires in Siberia, around 18,000 individual fires, huge release of carbon, and a temperature record of 38 degrees within the Arctic Circle, which was a record above that particular latitude. Am I running out of time slightly? How much time do I have? 10 minutes, okay, yeah, no problem. So what we did here was to look at the fires that occurred during that summer in different parts of Siberia. The green area here is the three Siberian ecoregions. We're kind of not interested in fires that occurred outside of that region. Again, that's about our definition. And we've used satellite-derived detections of individual fires, and then used the fire radiated power to show the intensity of the fires in different locations. And we then identified a series of 13 hotspots, which are 500-kilometer diameter circles around the largest fires, but ensuring that all of these areas are all independent. We're not considering the same area twice. And then we consider the information from the climate model within each of these larger circles. We don't want to be too precise about our definition, because in principle a fire could occur outside of that precise location where it occurred. Just a little bit more information about that. We can look at FWI anomalies. So this is how much higher the FWI was during the summer 2020, different parts of Siberia in comparison to the long-term average. So there were areas where it may have been high, but it wasn't necessarily higher than average. Where it was really, really extreme, I suppose, was in the north. That's what was particularly notable about the 2020 season. And if we look at approximately the same figure, but in terms of probability of occurrence, we're seeing that in areas of the far north, this is kind of beyond the 99th percentile in probability of occurrence. So certainly in the far north, the conditions were particularly extreme relative to how they would be usually. And what we did for each of the hotspots, and I'll use an example here. If I just focus on this one, they don't have names, sadly, just hotspot K in this case. We take a climate model simulation for an historical period, and then we take annual maxima of 7-day fire weather index values, and we fit those block maxima to a generalized extreme value distribution. And then we scale that distribution to with global mean surface temperature. So we can scale it to the climate of the present or to the climate of the past. So In the case of the blue line, that's the distribution of extremes scaled to the climate of 1880, essentially, yeah, 40 years ago. And then in the red, scaled to the climate of 2020. And what that allows us to do is to identify the return period of our 2020 extreme value that we identified in 2020. So if that was scaled to the climate of 1880, we'd have a return period of approximately 80 years. But when that's scaled to the climate of 2020, that return period is around 45 years. And then we're able to calculate a probability ratio, essentially. So we can make a statement about this particular event occurring in this particular part of Siberia. A fire weather index of that particular magnitude is now 1.7 times, 1.78 times more likely than it would have been 140 years ago. And that's as a result of global temperature rise. So essentially, global warming is the driving factor. And we repeated that extreme value analysis across all 13 of those hotspots. But it's not the case that we find an increase everywhere, and it's not the case that that increase is always significant. So here we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 circles that are associated with a probability ratio greater than 1, but only 5 of those are where that is statistically significant. Okay. So essentially, it's not everywhere. It is largely dominated by what we see in the north, and that's perhaps unsurprising. We obviously consider uncertainty margins with each of these, but we've got for each of those individual locations our probability ratios and then 95% confidence intervals associated with each of those. You can see the example I showed on screen was K there. That was the most obvious, or the largest probability ratio. But by essentially doing 13 different analyses that are all the same methodology but independent, it means that we can combine them together at the end. And that's what we tried to do to make a statement that the extreme fire conditions associated with this event in 2020 are up to 80% more likely as a result of global warming. And that's kind of the strap line behind the study that we did. And we've done a few more of these studies, with one in South Africa and another one for the European fires of 2022. Again, trying to do all of this analysis, but come up with a single strap line at the end. Just a couple final things, I suppose. When defining an extreme fire weather event, key considerations should be: should the definition be based on the fire, or should it be based on the prevailing meteorology, or should it be both potentially? That's something to consider. And also how sensitive the results might be to the spatial domain that's used, to the choice of the indicator for fire weather, or to the choice of climate model. This is an example. If we conducted the studies that in the case of the Siberia study, if I repeated that study across every single grid cell within the circumboreal region, and again, we've just identified those ecoregions that fall within the boreal biome. If we look across the whole area, for each of the different indices, I mean, for the FWI, you get more than half of these points, you get a significant increase. For some of those points, you get a significant decrease, and then grey would be where there's no apparent change. So in terms of the chosen indicator, you can get quite substantial differences depending on whether you choose FWI or potentially ISI, or for the build-up index, you get a lot more significant decreases. So it's particularly important because quite a lot of the time when a particular index is chosen, there's no real justification behind that choice. And there should be, because there is a strong sensitivity of these results to that. If we broke it down by ecoregion, we see even more that our results potentially vary. I'm not able to remember the names of these, but in Fennoscandia, for instance, that's a region where we know there are large differences between in different parts of Fennoscandia where we've got fire weather extremes. Indeed, there was a study conducted a few years ago on the fires that affected southern Sweden in 2018, I think, that wasn't able to make a significant conclusion that was related to climate change. So there's sensitivity to the index, there's sensitivity to the region, and that's something to be really clear about when we're thinking about extremes. And there's also sensitivity to the choice of climate model. So I've got 6 different climate models here, and I've essentially repeated the analysis I've just showed. There are substantial differences if we consider what's going on perhaps in North America. In this particular model, that area looks rather different to what we have in this model, or even the model at the top. Without going into too much difference. So any kind of study that's focusing on fire weather extremes, should consider which climate model is most appropriate, not just in representation of the mean, but also in representation of the extremes as well. There's also scope for these attribution studies to be based on other forest-related impacts. I don't have any examples. I just know in principle it's something that could be done. It would be quite nice to do, not just about fire, but potentially about another climate-driven extreme event. That's more or less it. Sorry if I've talked for a little longer than I planned to, but I'll just leave that summary up there. So evaluation of the representation of fire weather shows those substantial regional differences. We should be very clear if we are using climate projections for fire weather danger or fire weather projections, which model is most appropriate in which particular region. And yes, I'm eager to see if this weighted approach to fire weather projections is published soon. Hopefully it will be. That's everything I wanted to say. Thank you very much for listening. And if there are some questions, I'll take some questions. Thank you.
Merci, Jonathan. C'était vraiment très intéressant. Je
Merci.
prends des questions. I have plenty of questions, but
Merci.
I will leave the talk to the public. Est-ce que vous avez des questions dans la salle? On va commencer par la salle et ensuite on va aller en vidéoconférence. Les gens en vidéoconférence peuvent aussi écrire leurs questions dans le chat. On va pouvoir les lire pour vous. Si vous vous gênez à parler en anglais, vous pouvez l'écrire en français, on va les lire pour vous. Oui, Maxence?
Thank you for the presentation. It was very interesting to see your approach. And it was very interesting to see at the beginning that you discussed about downscaling, because I always see people that are trying to do upscaling. So it was interesting to see the reverse. But there's a last question, because right now, if I take the perspective of forest manager, we try to see how in Quebec and Canada we can manage the forest differently to be sure to be more resilient and resistant to fires. And it shows that we have very accurate, precise model of a landscape. Is very important to better know which management strategies we can have in the landscape, because we cannot just say, okay, we just put hardwood species everywhere. Maybe we can choose areas where we can focus on the management of specific fire-adapted management. And my question is, to which extent we can have a reliable spatial resolution in this kind of model, and at which scale is it become to be too random to be used from a very practical perspective?
Yeah, great question. And yes, with these global models, they are ultimately limited by the spatial resolution. It differs quite a lot between the 16 that I showed there, for instance. But generally, if we're considering a regional scale study, there are different ways which we can downscale the global model, statistically, potentially, or use regional model projections. A regional climate model would be a limited area, but nested within a larger model. So there might be regional model for Europe or for North America or for Africa, or even sort of a sub-region like the Mediterranean. And regional climate modeling is a separate field in itself. You would get the best resolution with the global models is around 50-kilometer grid cells, which is not so useful if you're considering things on a management scale. With the latest generation of regional models, that's around 11 kilometers. So it's better. That will be improved further, hopefully. There is another layer of models down from that called convection permitting models, which a lot of the time with our climate models that we generate or that are run, things like convection, precipitation, evaporation are not physically represented, they're parameterized. Whereas the convective model is doing that on the basis of physical principles. And it's great because you get a 2-kilometer resolution, but it takes forever to run and you perhaps only get one. So the UK climate projections, for instance, in the United Kingdom, use all 3 levels of models. If you've got a very good observational data set, if, for instance, if you had a reference point in different places with a fire weather index or a long sort of time series of, well, it doesn't have to be fire weather index, it could be any variable, then statistical bias correction of the climate model is also something that's possible. So there's many ways to do that. When it comes to the fire weather index, because we've got 4 input fields, we have to bias correct those together. They can be done together. There is multivariate bias correction. So we keep the kind of physical consistency in those 4 variables together. And that would allow us to essentially create or simulate a fire weather index which is more representative for that particular spatial scale. But it should always be user driven, I suppose, by the end user, what the information is going to be used for, what scale is most appropriate. Because, yeah, you're quite right, at the scale of the global models, that's not particularly helpful when you're considering things on a forest management scale. So downscaling should be a big part of this, to be honest. I just haven't got there yet.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a small question. I'm not expert in the climate modeling, but I'm wondering if they use the species, for example, if they are, at least for fires model, they use the species, for example, this conifer or deciduous or the age of the species, they included in the model or not, or they just use the climate data?
So, yeah, not in the climate models. No, you would. There's land surface models for sure, land surface components within those models, but the fire models specifically that I know of, yes, absolutely consider species, or maybe not species level, but at least some classification of forest types. I'm currently involved in a European network which is bringing together, yeah, a number of people working broadly in the field of fire in lots of different places. And one of the issues when it comes to fire models is that there's often a model being developed here, a model being developed there, and it's difficult to know exactly what's in each one and to what extent bringing those together can be mutually beneficial. So my understanding is that, yes, certainly some of those consider things, if not at species level, then certainly at some degree of classification, but not necessarily all of them.
Well, thank you very much for this presentation. I'm not an expert in models or statistics, but I was wondering, when weighting the forces and weaknesses of each model, why not use an ensemble-based estimation to only use the forces of multiple models in a certain case and not the weaknesses at the same time?
In certain cases, you mean certain areas or?
Yeah, certain areas, yeah.
I mean, yeah, that essentially would be one way of, I suppose in some respect, that is what we're doing. I mean, just in terms of ensemble, number of different models. The evaluation that I showed was on a single realization of each model because different models have different ensembles, different ensemble sizes. The Canadian one, for instance, I think is one of the larger ones. There's 50 different simulations there. So the projections that we have for the future they are all based on ensembles. So some of them are larger than others, but all of the ensembles are weighted in the same way. Now we don't consider the skill of the individual members, but that is potentially something that could be done. I suppose different approaches to doing that. But yes, the weighting is done individually for each grid point. So you're capturing that kind of regional distinction. It's not like we take a weighting across the whole world, or it's very much done on a grid by grid point basis. If you were to focus on a particular region and downscale to a particular region, maybe you could do it a single weighting across that entire space. But yeah, we did it on a grid point by grid point basis. Yeah. Thanks.
I maybe have a question with what Guillaume said. But is it also for computational limits that you don't compare models like based on approaches like likelihood functions, etc.? Since you have a lot of parameters, computationally it would take forever. I mean,
Yeah. So, I mean, log likelihood, the maximum log likelihood would be something that we would use to determine what was the best statistical fit, certainly for those extreme value models.
you can compare observations with the predictions.
Yeah.
And then predictions binded to certain parameters, and then have your
so
like computationally, I think it will be too much.
Well, that's what was done for fitting those extreme value distributions. That's using maximum likelihood estimation, and that takes a while depending on what algorithm you're using. But yeah, it is computationally intensive for sure, and that's not even the modeling side, not the physical modeling side. That's the statistical modeling. Yeah. So that's post processing. Yeah, there was a lot of we managed to convince the university to buy us a new computer to do all of this. So, yeah.
Nice. Does it get done? I might have one last question. Just I feel a question about extreme analysis. It is extremely interesting for us, but each time when we do modeling, I wonder how much tautology we have. Since when you train your model for extreme values based on the extreme values you see, but by definition, extreme values are extreme. We have a few instrumental records of that, we discussed about it, but they also goes outside the range of variability that you would expect. And I think that it was very clear in your case study, because you see that it was underestimated in the southern region, just because probably you didn't have instrumental records of that kind of event.
Yeah.
But it is just because climate change is something like with a lot of and of course, like it's an anthropogenic person. But maybe it is always problematic for this. Like, are we expected to lose money every time just because of that? Because it is a range that it is by definition like very difficult to predict.
Yeah.
It is unexpected.
Right. Yeah, it is really difficult, and having those, one way of representing kind of unseen extremes, or hoping to capture unseen extremes, is to have these large ensembles, where in principle, even if you find it 1 in 1,000-year event, you have 100-year simulations that are run 10 times, then at least you'll in statistical principle, you'll capture one of those. It is difficult to extrapolate anything statistical. I mean, one thing with those extreme models, and something we did for the study in the Mediterranean, was not only to look at the scale to the climate of the past and the present, but also climate that's 1.5 degrees warmer than the pre-industrial era, 2 degrees warmer. Then you can at least say what the likelihood of reaching a particular extreme is in the future, but you're almost always starting with a known threshold in your mind of what constitutes an extreme, rather than what will a 100-year event look like in 50 years' time, or what will a 1 in 100-year heat wave be like in terms of duration and also intensity. It's inherently difficult to do.
Then it is also an issue of time frame. Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
D'autres questions? Ah, on n'est pas clair?
Merci pour la question.
Bon, ben, merci beaucoup.
Merci beaucoup.
Euh,
Merci beaucoup. Merci
cette prochaine
pour la
émission,
question.
on va essayer avec.